You are listening to American Ambassadors Live, the podcast on international affairs sponsored by the Council of American Ambassadors in Washington, D.C. The Council is the association of non-career U.S. ambassadors who have represented America under presidents from John F. Kennedy through Donald Trump.
Our guest today is Ambassador Georgette Mosbacher, who was U.S. Ambassador to Poland from 2017 to 2021. She was the first female ambassador to Poland and is an internationally recognized entrepreneur, author, diplomat, and speaker. Thanks for joining us today.
I'm happy to be here. Thank you, Mr. Ambassador.
Poland is an important country under any circumstances, but it's a particularly important country these days because of Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine. It's the biggest frontline state. It's right in the middle of it. It's taken many millions of refugees. And it's been a center of conflict with Russia over centuries, really, as well as recently an ally of the United States. Tell me a little bit about how the war in Ukraine and the relationship with Russia and Poland and the United States looks today from Poland.
Well, surprisingly, it doesn't look a lot different. Poland has been beating the drum about the threat of Russia for certainly the entire time I was there. And it was making arrangements in terms of spending over 2% on its military, building a terminal to take LNG gas. We did $54 million worth of LNG deals, so that Poland was already looking ahead. It knew that Russia was a threat, all right? So unfortunately, no one listened to them. However, the United States was very robust in working with the Poles on the LNG. We also signed a civilian nuclear deal, which it was another step toward that energy independence that Poland was trying to get to. Poland hasn't stopped that drive. It's changed a little bit because our energy independence in the United States has changed. However, they also just made another big purchase for their military. And so they've been concerned about this for as long as they've known freedom, which is a little over 30 years now. I would say the United States has always been very supportive from the day that they did get their independence. We continued to train with their troops. We put up the 5th Corps headquarters while I was ambassador, which is now the command and control, NATO's command and control for that area, particularly with Ukraine. This is the far forward command and control in Poland, in Poznan. So I would say Ukraine, of course, Ukraine and Poland share this extraordinary border. Over 7 million Ukrainians have crossed that border into Poland since the war. The Poles have taken them into their homes. There are no camps. That alone is a pretty incredibly, I would say, it should be a model for how people treat people. It's been remarkable. And so consequently, and the United States has supported all of this. And I hope we will continue to do so. So I would say it hasn't changed. The war hasn't changed the attitude in Poland very much, because they've always felt Russia's threat. And the United States has always considered Poland an important ally.
How dependent is Poland on Russian energy today?
Well, actually, just before I left, they did not re-sign their contract with Gazprom.
Wow.
They already were importing enough LNG that they didn't need to renew that contract. So sure, they still have some dependence, but overall, they were far ahead of anyone.
So they're in much better shape than, let's say, Germany is.
There's a much better shape. And right now, they're trying to get the financing to do the civilian nuclear. Now, of course, that's a long-term solution, but they've been on top of this. They've had this plan in place. We spent a lot of time on that plan while I was in Poland. So they're in a very good shape.
How are they doing economically, given inflation in much of Europe, partly related to energy, but partly related to supply disruptions and grain and all those things?
Well, first of all, Poland was unique in that even in the 2014 meltdown, shall we say, economic meltdown, Poland still was growing by double digits. It was not affected by that. Quite remarkable. It's had double-digit growth for 30 years now. However, with COVID and then the war, the high inflation, high interest rates, 7 million refugees pouring over the border, the readiness that it cost, the readiness of the Polish army, it's now taking its toll. And this is going to be difficult for Poland because they've had this growth for so long and they've been able to make these investments. And now when they need it the most, that growth is collapsed. So they're in a better position than most because they were part of the supply line for Europe, certainly for Germany. But nevertheless, this is now going to impact them. They're struggling now to redo a budget that first was they didn't plan for COVID, and then they didn't plan for the war. So they've had a double whammy in terms of budgeting, and it's going to hurt them.
Is that creating a political backlash against their strong support for NATO and for Ukraine or not?
Not at all. I mean, the Poles are, they're very sensitive to their history. They understand the threat of Russia, and they are keen supporters of NATO. They are supporting Ukraine with everything they've got. But I will say that while I was ambassador, supporting Ukraine, United States was very, very gung-ho about supporting Ukraine when Zelensky was elected, hoping there would be reforms and so forth. The Poles were a little reluctant. They wanted to see more reforms before they committed. They said they'd been down that road before, and they were just going to sit maybe back a little bit until they saw some reforms. Well, they're in full now. And I also think, given their geographical position, they're going to be a big part of the rebuilding of Ukraine. So, and that supply line. And look, Poland didn't get as hurt as many countries did because they were part of a supply line, certainly for car parts for Germany. So they were in a pretty good place and will continue to be.
How do you see Russia in this? Obviously an aggressor, obviously in the wrong. I mean, more in the sense of Russia's not going to go away. At some point, the conflict will end. There's a view, I think, pretty widely held from what I understand in Ukraine, that the only acceptable end is when Russia withdraws from all the areas it's occupied since 2014. There are other people in other countries who are saying no, there ought to be some settlement between Russia and Ukraine in the short run. Is that an issue that is top of mind in Poland among Polish policymakers?
Well, certainly, for several reasons. One, a lot of these refugees think they're going home. And 7 million refugees in Poland, they actually believe they're going to go back home and that they're not in Poland permanently. And to sustain that, if it were to be permanent, this war were to go on for a long time, would be incredibly costly. So, of course, the Poles are concerned, what is the end game here? And then in the region, I'm co-chairman with General Jones of the 3 Seas Initiative, the 12 countries in Central Eastern Europe. And they're concerned because, of course, the longer this war goes, we continue to have the refugee crisis, but the cost and what happens when Putin decides to turn the gas off, right? We're about to find that out next couple months. But what I think the question is floating out there is, what does winning look like? And assuming that they win and get their borders back, Ukraine, what happens to Russia? What's the policy? What will be the EU policy, United States policy, the Western world policy toward Russia? Russia is not Cuba or Venezuela. I mean, it's one of the largest landmass on earth, a couple 100 million people. Going to have to figure out, how do we coexist with them? And what does that look like? And what do we do with Putin? These are very real questions. I personally have not seen any real policy thinking around this, and that does concern me.
One of the debates around the end game that's been pretty public is some people in the United States and in Europe saying the end game needs to be Russia under Putin permanently weakened, so that he's not emboldened to do this again or in different directions in terms of destabilizing peace in Europe. Another point of view is that this needs to be sort of brought back into the kind of relationship we had maybe during the Cold War. Do the Poles have any particular unified vision on that? Are they sort of hawks or doves on that question, I guess is the way I'd ask it.
You know, I don't think, I would say that they have no choice. They share a border with Russia, and they'd like to have a positive relationship with Russia. Now this war has really thrown that into confusion. So I would say that if all things being equal, the Poles would like to see some sort of ceasefire between Russia and Ukraine, and in something in which they could have a negotiated peace, where Russia isn't a pariah state, isn't a failed state. I mean, let's be frank here. Assad is still in Syria, right? So they don't want to see a Syria. They don't want to see that happen. They don't want to see a failed state. Certainly not a failed state at that size. So they would like to see some sort of negotiated ceasefire, one that obviously doesn't reward Russia, but does allow the fighting, the death, the devastations to stop, and there be some agreement made that allows them to coexist.
Gotcha. One of the more remarkable things about Putin's invasion of Ukraine is the way it's unified NATO and unified the European Union. Obviously, one of Putin's bets was that it would divide NATO and the European Union. Obviously, it's done the reverse, including expanding NATO. So, I mean, from Poland's point of view, having Sweden and Finland on Russia's border, I presume, is all upside.
Well, you know, Mr. Ambassador, I have to say, so much of my time as ambassador in Poland was about fighting for the fact that, you know, all the countries should be paying their fair share, what their commitment was, their 2%. Poland was. Actually, Poland was not only paying 2%, but more. And that was really like pulling teeth, I have to tell you. The number of speeches I gave with respect to, hey, you know, it's time for you to step up and take responsibility for your own security, as well as your own energy security. And it was a difficult sell. Well, that has turned on a dime. I've been stunned by the fact that all of a sudden nuclear is back on the table, civilian nuclear is back on the table, LNG is back on the table, and they're making these investments in their own security. So I would say Putin, if Putin did nothing else, he literally triggered, excuse the pun, but he triggered NATO's coming together and realizing what security really meant and what they had to do about it, particularly their energy security. NATO and the EU, well, EU has had failed policies on that for over a decade, and now it's come to roost.
Well, speaking of the EU, before the invasion of Ukraine, Poland was controversial in the EU in terms of its rule of law, in terms of constitutional procedures, and there was a feeling in a variety of countries that they weren't really keeping to the European values in some ways. Has that dynamic changed at all with the war, or is it just put aside for the time being and we're working together on fighting back? Putin will get back to that once we get past the war.
I wish I could say that that's gone away, but it hasn't. To your point, I think it's just been set aside. So I think so much of that has been driven. My experience there, and I watched it, I read it, I saw it, by disinformation, by hybrid warfare. Russia's very good at it. Look, Poland has some issues with its judiciary. I'm not going to judge that because we have our own issues. But to suggest that Poland is anything but a democratic country is completely absurd and driven by false information. It had an elected president. No one in the world challenged that wasn't a free and fair election, presidents, or their congressional elections. Look, they're only 30 years into this democratic process, but their institutions that I worked with are very strong, democratic, well-run. Sure, I understand the issue with the judiciary, but to suggest that it is not a democratic country or it's backsliding on democratic values is just plain unfair.
In terms of relationship with the other European Union countries, though, I mean, that's been a source of strain with the other European Union countries. I'm just wondering if sort of diplomatically, politically, that has caused problems or just not been a problem at all in terms of Poland and the rest of the EU working together, like with sanctions against Russia.
It's been a big problem, and it continues to be. But I think the genesis of that problem is the fact that Poland is the largest country in this Eastern Central Europe.
Sure.
And I just don't think the powers that be that run the EU, meaning France and Germany, they see Poland as the, how can I put this, somehow the stepchild. And Poland started to get its own voice because of its growth and its success. And I think there are those who just didn't want to pay attention and didn't like it when Poland stood up for what some of the values it believed that were not necessarily contradictory to our values, but they've been treated and continue to be treated as the poor stepchild. And I think that's the mistake, because that's now how the Poles see themselves anymore. They see themselves, given their energy policy, given their role in NATO, they see themselves as an important member of the European Union table and expect to be heard and respected.
And clearly being on the front line with the war in Ukraine, they're extremely important to the European Union and to NATO and to the United States. Mm-hmm. Ambassador Mosbacher, thank you for joining us today.
My pleasure.
This is Ambassador Jim Rosapepe for American Ambassadors Live podcast.
This has been the American Ambassadors Live podcast. To hear more from us, subscribe to the American Ambassadors Live podcast and leave us a review. Tweet us your thoughts on this week's episode and tag us at AMER Ambassadors using the hashtag AmbassadorsLive.